Good evening, everyone. Welcome again to another wonderful episode of the Dialogue Institute of Kansas City. And when I say episode, I mean there's these constant webinars and educational episodes would be the word. And tonight is another wonderful one. And we have our guest back, Dr. Craig Considine, that I will say a little bit more about in a minute. But tonight is, the topic is Jesus and Muhammad's, peace be upon him, exemplary life on peace and forgiveness. And when I heard that title, An Exemplary Life on Peace and Forgiveness, I have to confess, I went, oh, that's like a lifelong journey. Which I think it should be a lifelong journey, and always learning and always growing and always striving toward living a life of peace and forgiveness internally and externally. So as I said, I'm Reverend Kelly Isla. I'm Chair Emeritus for the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council, and I have a lot of other titles and letters after my name, but we're just going to hop right into tonight. Briefly, though, I want to start with letting you know about a little bit about the Dialogue Institute of Kansas City, in case you're not familiar with who they are. Sitting here is Ayub Essen, wave Ayub. He's the Executive Director, and our guest is also on screen with us. But so the Dialogue Institute is an organization that is born out of the Hizmet movement, that is based on the teachings of Fethullah Gulen, who is a remarkable man. He lives in Pennsylvania. He's certainly getting a little elderly, and there's much to be learned from his life. The principles of peace and forgiveness and social justice and science and spirituality. And, you know, he's my kind of peacemaker, because it's not about, you know, everything being calm and sitting in the lotus position, because sometimes peacemaking requires, you know, pushing the envelope a little bit. And, or as the late Congressman John Lewis from Georgia used to say, get into good trouble, right? So, and I think that our topic tonight about Jesus and Muhammad, peace be upon him, is about that. So the Dialogue Institute is an organization founded on those principles and is involved all over. There's a Dialogue Institute of Kansas City. There's a satellite in Oklahoma. There's the mother organization is the Dialogue Institute of the Southwest. There's in Dallas, and I'm leaving other cities out, and Ayub can tell you more at the end. But all of the organizations are about interfaith dialogue, about being in service to the community, about acknowledging those that are living a life of peace, of forgiveness, of justice, caring for each other. And even programs such as this that are more educational. And when we're not in COVID, you know, programs that are about coming together and for a Turkic food, festival that has wonderful food and music and crafts, water marbling classes, and just any way that you could imagine to building community, being in community, celebrating community. The Dialogue Institute is committed to that. So, and you can go to their website, the Dialogue Institute. You can Google them and find the different places they're located. So with that being said, I would like to just take a minute and introduce our speaker tonight. We will have time later after he speaks for some question and answer, or as I call it, Q&R, question and response, because sometimes I don't have an answer, but I'll have a response for you. So if you have a question anywhere during the evening in the chat box, because I know you're watching on YouTube, just put your question in there, or a comment even, and I'll be watching for that, and I'll make sure that I ask Craig about it when he's done. So just a little bit about Dr. Craig Considine. Am I saying that right? Considine?
You are. You got it.
I know someone with that last name, and that's how he pronounces it. And I thought, oh, I wonder if it's the same. He is a scholar, a professor, a global speaker, a media contributor, a public intellectual based at the Department of Sociology at Rice University. He's the author of many books and articles. Dr. Considine's opinions have been featured in the New York Times and the Washington Post, on CNN, BBC, CBS News, Fox News. It sounds like he gets around and talks to everybody, which is really, really good given the topic. MSNBC, Newsweek, Al Jazeera. He's been invited to speak at some of the leading international organizations and universities in the world. Dr. Considine is visible on social media. He's got and just a sidebar, if you follow him on Instagram, periodically you get to see a little picture of his daughter, who's just gorgeous. She's just gorgeous.
Thank you.
Yes, and
he's a blessing, a real blessing.
And on Twitter, follow him on Twitter. He holds a PhD from Trinity College, an MSc from Royal Holloway, University of London. He's really, 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 really smart. Dr. Considine is a U.S. citizen. He's Catholic and of Irish and Italian descent. So welcome.
Thank you, Reverend Kelly. It's good to be back. Abe, thank you so much as well to the Dialogue Institute and to everyone joining today. I hope you are well wherever you are. We were discussing before the session started when our last event was, and that was last May, I believe. Mm-hmm. And I remember the event fondly, and we were talking about the humanity of Muhammad, which is certainly linked to what we're going to be exploring here today in this talk. And I was also mentioning earlier to Reverend Kelly and to Abe about something that was actually maybe surprising. It actually surprised the two of you when I said, I've actually never properly given a 20 to 30 minute talk on Jesus and Muhammad, comparing them in this light, specifically peace and forgiveness. So I spent many hours actually over the last couple of days reading books, which I rarely do for these type of talks. Like usually it's a book talk and I'm familiar with my own work and I'm able to kind of just speak about it. But there was something with this subject that I think made me take it a bit more personally, and also it touched me. I mean, Jesus, Muhammad, peace, forgiveness. So we're not only dealing with extremely important historical figures, prophets, however you would like to categorize them, but we're dealing with something that feels very distant, peace and forgiveness. And as a Christian, for me, I must say, it is hard to be a Christian. It is hard to follow Jesus and to forgive and to engage in peace, work, and even to love one's enemies. This is, I suppose, the ultimate challenge, at least for me as a Christian, to struggle, or as the Islamic tradition might refer to it as, engage in the jihad, the struggle to improve society, to improve the self. So I'm really excited to bring you on a journey of the collection of knowledge that I've kind of put together over the last couple of days in preparing for this talk. And I want to begin by talking about actually a concept that brings us, at least in the Abrahamic tradition, full circle. And this is a Hebrew concept and a Jewish concept subsequently, which is called Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam, which means to heal a fractured world. To heal a fractured world. And I think this is what Jesus and Muhammad were doing. This was their mission, to heal a fractured world. Living 500 years apart in two different parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and obviously Jesus being in Jerusalem and Israel, Palestine. Similar environments that they both grew up in, and these environments shaped their positions on peace and forgiveness. But with Tikkun Olam, we're talking about the responsibility that we have for the material, the moral, and the spiritual welfare of our fellow human beings. So we as humans have this responsibility to heal a fractured world. And obviously, in the context of what I'm saying here, it's not just humans, it's Christians and Muslims. This is our responsibility. This is our calling, because this is what Jesus and Muhammad had done. So we have to go back to the historical kind of social context, I think, in which Jesus and Muhammad were both kind of operating. And I'm going to begin by focusing on Jesus, and then I'm going to get to Muhammad. I thought about designing this lecture around themes and then saying, this is what Jesus said, this is what Muhammad said. But I feel like we would lose the uniqueness of each figure in doing this, and it would be too thematic. So I'm going to bring you through my insight into Jesus first here. So what kind of world did Jesus and Muhammad grow up in? For Jesus, there is this assumption that he was being raised in a isolated area. Perhaps this is a historical assumption. Like I remember as a child in Catholic school, when we used to see images of Jesus, it was like he was on a hill and preaching to people kind of out in the country. But recent archaeological evidence, especially in Sepphoris, which is in the Holy Land, actually suggests that Nazareth, where Jesus spent a good deal of his formative years, it was actually quite hustle and bustle. So it was diverse. So there were a lot of languages. There was Greek, there was Hebrew, lots of languages happening, diversity, people coming in and out, not too dissimilar in some ways to what was happening in Mecca around the time of Muhammad's birth in 570. Jesus is also growing up in a time in which Caesar Augustus, all the way in Rome, is dictating and controlling what is happening in the Holy Land. And Caesar Augustus, had King Herod, who was creating this very vicious type of society that was corrupt. It was imperial. It was colonial. And the Roman forces would use violence against locals in order to suppress any type of rebellion. The inhabitants of the Holy Land at this time were heavily taxed. The leadership and the government were corrupt. The money was going to the rulers. And you had class conflict in Jesus's kind of native society. You had competition between farmers and fishermen and townspeople. You had great inequality. Civil rights didn't even exist. This idea was just not really around. This idea of like freedom of speech or freedom of religion, not understood as we understand it today. Even women, if you think of the traditional depiction of the Virgin Mary, she's indoors, she's fetching water, she's cooking, and so on and so forth. Now, I didn't talk about violence here, but these situations, these social conditions that I've just outlined, create a type of violence that is not necessarily seen or depicted through the sword. It's the type of kind of societal violence. It makes people depressed. It makes people angry. It makes people upset. It prevents people from entering friendships and relationships. So when I say that Jesus and Muhammad were engaging in Tikkun Olam to heal a fractured world, they were coming to heal these societal ills, which were creating a social violence, not necessarily a physical violence. Now, with Muhammad, if we actually compare Nazareth and Mecca, some interesting parallels, broadly speaking. In Mecca, you had hyper-tribalism. You had essentially what I've referred to in previous books as an ethnic nation, or even a racial nation, in which your sense of belonging to a given society was really predicated on the family that you were born into, the color of your skin. So we're talking about hyper-tribal, generation-long tribal conflicts, hyper-material, because of course the Kaaba was the center of a polytheistic, spectrum of gods and worship, and it was a place that people congregated, and there was a lot of economic progress happening. So people were getting wealthy. As I mentioned earlier, people were getting wealthy in the Holy Land with Jesus, but the inequality was so vast that the people at the top were getting their share and the people at the bottom were getting nothing. So Mecca was a hub of sorts. Perhaps there was a breakdown of what Ibn Khaldun referred to as asabiya, that social cohesion, that glue in society. Talking Mecca here, around 570. Extreme individualism. People were caring about what they wore, what they could buy, what they could purchase. And of course, this creates social tension. It creates social inequality, but you also had things that were much more deeply dark in some ways, things like slavery and racism and the oppression of women. Not only women, but baby girls having no value in society. So again, I didn't even mention violence here. So when we think about peace and violence or peace and war, war and violence doesn't necessarily have to involve drones and bombs. It could be something more invisible, harder to detect, but equally detrimental to a society. And it's also worth noting, before I move on, that the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century and in the 7th century was squeezed between empires. To the west, you had the Byzantine Christian Empire, and to the east, you had the Sasanian or Persian Empire. And I've done some research on this. I have a book coming out in a couple months called People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. And I talk about how Muhammad carefully navigated his way around these empires in a very diplomatic way, in a very skilled way, and ultimately with peace on his mind. There's a really good book, if I can promote this. It's by Juan Cole. It's called The Prophet of Peace. And it talks about Muhammad's ability to navigate within these civilizations. So going back to this chaos issue and what is violence and peace. So let me stress it again. When we talk about the need for Tikkun Olam, to heal a fractured world, we're talking about social ills, psychological matters, class issues, spirituality issues, and well-being issues. So the question then becomes, what did Jesus and Muhammad do to respond to these social ills? So now it's kind of forcing us to look at Jesus and Muhammad as social problems workers. So forget for a second theological claims. Forget claims to prophethood and whether Jesus is the Son of God. Let's look at these individuals as social problem or historical figures. I'm trying to be politically correct. Let's look at them as social beings, people who were trying to work on the ground to immediately ease the pain and the suffering of their fellow human beings. So I would say that, and again, Reverend Kelly, before we started talking, you had mentioned the word peacemaker. And this is quite important. And I would like to distinguish this concept peacemaker from peacekeeper. There's a difference between these two terms. And really the difference resides in the active level that we see in a peacemaker. So a peacemaker is someone who is going out and creating something. When you go and make something, it's from scratch, something like that. But with a peacekeeper, it's kind of status quo, and it's very kind of surface level. Like you're doing good work. I'm not saying peacekeeping is not bad, but I am saying that peacemaking is an ideal that we should strive for as human beings, as Christians and Muslims. And this is kind of our link back to Tikkun Olam. So what did Jesus and Muhammad do to heal a fractured world? They got out there. They were energetic. They were working with people. They were working with communities. They were making themselves vulnerable. They were getting their hands dirty. They were doing unpopular things, and they did it not for fame, not for notoriety, but because they had an understanding, they had a gift, they had a blessing from God, and God used them to engage in the Tikkun Olam. So let me talk about Jesus here. And I want to alert you to another scholar, Gary Wills. Gary Wills is a prominent, popular author, and he's a professor at Northwestern University. And Professor Wills has become a favorite author of mine within the last 2 or 3 years. And I learned about him through his research on the Quran. And he wrote a book called What the Quran Meant. And it was a fascinating insight from a kind of Christian scholar. Now, Professor Wills also wrote a book called What Jesus Meant. What Jesus Meant. And this is a profound book, and one that significantly shapes my understanding of Jesus, and in doing so, creates a bridge and a parallel to Muhammad, because again, I see them very much engaged in Tikkun Olam. So much of what I'm going to say is inspired by Professor Wills. So when we talk about Jesus, one of the things, and for the Catholics in the audience, I hope you had the same experience when you were a youth in school, when they were talking about Christian identity. What did it mean? And we were always taught to think of yourselves as preferring yourself to be last rather than first, preferring yourself to be the least and not the greatest. That's very hard to do, to live a completely selfless life of service, to not feel inspired by achievement and not wanting to do great things. Just taking a complete step back and saying, I want to be least. I want to be among those who are suffering the most. And we know through the New Testament and the gospel specifically, that Jesus was one of these individuals who was going out there and trying to make this peace, getting his hands dirty. And he was not doing it just for Christians. I mean, the term Christian didn't even exist when Jesus was here, which is a story for another day, I suppose. But Jesus did not limit his peacemaking or even his forgiveness to certain groups of people. And we know Muhammad did something quite similar. Jesus preferred the company of the lowly, the forgotten, and the despised, blatantly sending a message to the power players in society that, my message and my kingdom is not part of your realm. I represent this other realm, and trying to assist these people in overcoming these social ills that we addressed earlier. It's also, if you want to get into the miracle element of Jesus's life and legacy, you'll notice too, it's quite interesting that many of the miracles that Jesus performs are not for kind of people within his tribe. They were carried out largely on outsiders, what we would consider an outsider. So he was performing miracles on women. In Mark chapter 7, verse 29, a woman from Tyre, he performs a miracle there. On non-Jews, on the centurion in Luke chapter, I think it's in chapter 7, verse 9, he performs a miracle on the centurion, or the leper from Samaria, which is also documented in Luke. So when Jesus is engaging in this healing, he's not saying, well, you need to believe this, you need to believe a certain way before I heal you, right? And that's a message for us in peacemaking and forgiving, and also any type of social work. Are we really trying to limit our reach, or are we really in it to help everyone? I also think we have to talk about Jesus's what we might refer to as a radical love. Jesus, I believe, was a radical for his time, which is sometimes difficult for us to digest, because that term radical has become so polluted because of violence and war and politics. But Jesus was engaged in a process in many ways of radical love, loving the people on the periphery of society that have been forgotten, that have been left behind. It's also worth noting that Jesus often also crossed lines of ritual purity. So going against these old Jewish customs to deal with unclean people. So we know in the gospel, Jesus is dealing with lepers, the insane, the possessed, prostitutes, adulterers, and even collaborators with Rome. Jesus said, these are the people that I am here to help, to serve, to heal. I want to read a passage that Professor Wills wrote, which I find to be very powerful. So these are Professor Wills' words in light of what I just mentioned. Professor Wills says, Jesus does not work miracles for his own sake, and he rebukes those who ask him to do so. His miracles are targeted to teach lessons about the heavenly reign he brings with him. And one of the main lessons is that people should not be separated into classes of the clean and the unclean, the worthy and the unworthy, the respectable and the unrespectable. He told his followers they are privileged since they enter into a new intimacy with the Father, or God, through his own identification with the Father, God. But if they try to make that a privilege to be used against others or each other, they are betraying the points of their union with God, whose love is undiscriminating and inclusive, not gradated and exclusive. I mean, what a powerful statement in terms of serving unconditionally, of loving unconditionally. It's one of the hardest things to do, and it makes you really wonder in terms of peacemaking and forgiveness. Like, how far are we willing to go to engage in these processes? Forgiving is especially hard. Some of the hardest things I've personally had to deal with would be issues pertaining to forgiveness, but it was also some of the best things. I'm so glad I forgave too. And then, of course, let me read quickly from Matthew chapter 5, verses 44 and 45, where Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who afflict you, so that you may be children of God of the heavens, who orders the sun to shine on the bad as well as the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. Now, this work that Jesus was engaged in, this peacemaking work to heal the world as a social problems worker, came with ramifications, serious ramifications. And if you're familiar with the gospel, you'll know that Jesus was never an insider, really. He was always someone on the margins of society, never quite fitting in, always kind of being different or odd or out of context. And we also know that he was rejected by his own family, which Muhammad was as well. Muhammad was also, if you think about it, an outcast, right? Someone who's bringing a monotheistic message linked to Judaism and Christianity and Abraham and God and the Day of Judgment. And even his own Hashemite clan members and the Quraysh as well were saying, who is this guy? What is he saying? This is just ridiculous. It surely happened. So we see an interesting parallel, not only are the prophets rejected in their home countries, but they're often rejected by those who are closest to them. We also know that Jesus, because of his activities to heal a fractured world, he was called things by, the Pharisees, like he was an agent of the devil, or he was actually the devil himself, that he was unclean. because he was dealing with the sick, and that he was promoting immorality. And Professor Wills even says in Luke chapter 17, verse 16, that Jesus is accused of things like being a drunkard. So all of these things that position him as an outsider. Now, shifting gears, if I may, for about 5 minutes to Muhammad. And as I established earlier, the social conditions in which Muhammad was reared and raised were not too dissimilar to the situation that Jesus had kind of grown up in. Now, while it's not a pillar of Islam, the emphasis that Muhammad placed on jihad is very, very thought-provoking and important, because the term jihad has been hijacked by not only extremists, but also media entities. And there's this association that jihad is only linked to holy war and violence. But this is not true. While self-defense is permissible in the Islamic tradition, Muhammad had said to his companions that the greatest jihad is the jihad against the self and the desires. And if we juxtapose that individuality, I think that's what Muhammad was saying, like this kind of hyper ego person who only cares for themselves and who only lives for pleasure, and who's greedy and consumes. Muhammad is saying this is the greatest jihad, is to resist that and to rebel against that. And the best way to rebel against that is to engage with communities, especially those who might be on the periphery or dealing with struggles. So Muhammad's peacemaking is actually, and this is no disrespect to Jesus, Muhammad's peacemaking actually went to a higher level of society. It went to the government realm, because Muhammad was the head of a state, essentially, where Jesus was not the head of a state. And we know that Muhammad engaged with the Jews of Medina and the pagans of Medina around 622 to enter a pact, a contract, again called the Constitution of Medina, that was deliberately designed to stop violence and to stop warfare and to stop the generation-long feud between the warring tribes of Medina. Muhammad was literally invited to Medina to be the mediator, to be the peacemaker, because one, he was objective, he was rational, but two, he had a higher mission, he had a higher purpose, and this, as I'm arguing, is Tikkun Olam. We also have other examples of straight up nonviolence in Muhammad's life and legacy. Around 628, 629, we have the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which is essentially a ceasefire that Muhammad had entered with the Quraysh of Mecca, his arch enemies, his largest rivals, and saying, we're gonna cease this. I think most scholars would always say that Muhammad always went and chose peace first. And if the Ummah had to defend itself, it would. But peace was always the number one option. And again, we have to be careful in comparing Jesus and Muhammad on this issue of violence, nonviolence, right? Because Muhammad is the head of a state. He's the president, he's the general, and he's responsible for all of these people and this project that they're building. And then people would say, well, Jesus never engaged in war. Well, because Jesus had a different mission. They're two kind of different roles that these individuals were playing. And I want to stress here, and this is one of the reasons why I admire Muhammad so much, is because he faced tremendous persecution in Mecca. amongst his own tribe and amongst his own family. And it didn't stop him from engaging in this broader mission, this broader, more general social problems work to heal society, to give people something substantial away from these material goods and ideas of religious supremacy. He was giving them something that could truly bring peace to people. Not a ceasefire type peace, but a lifestyle, a mindset that fosters peace, that makes peace. Hence, we come back to the peacemaking element of this. And you notice all of these examples that I'm giving, it's all active. It's Jesus and Muhammad not just, preaching to the choir or existing in echo chambers and just saying these things to be heard. They're actually going out and making a difference. They're making the peace. They're contributing to a constructive solution to social ills. So in conclusion, I would say the following about Jesus and Muhammad. And I mean this not in a disrespectful way. They were going against the grain. They were what we would refer to as unpopular rebels. But Reverend Kelly, it's so funny that you started that introduction talking about the late John Lewis, talking about good trouble. I honestly think Jesus and Muhammad were engaging in this good trouble. God's trouble, that's God using Jesus and Muhammad to say, hey, this is why you're here. You're here to fix this. This is the Tikkun Olam. Jesus and Muhammad stood for people that few other people would stand for, bringing in the periphery of society. They were energetic in their commitment. They were going nonstop, realizing that peace is not something that can just happen like that. Peace takes time. It takes effort. It takes years. But ultimately, I think it starts with us. And it starts with us thinking about what is peace, really? What is peace? Is it the absence of war? Is it the absence of violence? Or is peace something in us? Love, comfort, warmth, trust, friendship. I think we would be better if we thought of peace in this way. And I'll stop there.
Well, I could have let you keep going and I could have listened for a lot longer. Thank you very much. As always, it's a pleasure and a privilege. And I'm like I'm making my own little comments and questions. And then I remember I have to look at the visitors. They get to ask first.
That's right. Yeah. You're
So,
our host. Yeah.
yes. So there are a couple questions and a couple comments. So the first, there's a comment here. I wonder if Jesus was crucified more as a political prisoner than to redeem sinners. And I know that's not a question, but it just,
Yeah.
I thought it was a good comment that
Could it be both?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. It just caught my attention.
Well, I think the answer, well, there's no answer, right? Because it's not a question. But Reverend Kelly, you said it's either political or political prisoner, or what did you
I wonder if Jesus was crucified more as a political prisoner than to redeem sinners.
Okay, so the redeeming of sinners would suggest that, this was like God's action. And the political prisoner side of it seems like it's more kind of earthly, and it's like human beings kind of dictating what happened to Jesus. And I think it's a combination of both. I don't think you can disconnect the fact that Jesus was a political prisoner, but also here to redeem sins. I don't think you can divorce those two things. I think it's part of the same story.
Okay. So one of my So one of my question kind of comments was that when you were talking about Muhammad, was able to reach a higher place and he was really in command, um, and just some of the difference between, what Jesus did or what he was able to accomplish or go about peacemaking versus Muhammad. Also, I don't know much, certainly not as much as you do about the the landscape of where Muhammad lived. But Jesus was living 600 years earlier in Roman occupied, you know, Palestine. And so it would be, different. I don't know that he would have had there wasn't anywhere to go up to be in charge of, anything.
Yeah. Yeah, like Muhammad was filling in many ways like a vacuum, like the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire was basically surrounding the Arabian Peninsula, and both of these entities were kind of dropping in over the course of some generations, but they never really properly got a foothold. And perhaps this is part of the reason why Muhammad emerged, because he was basically filling the vacuum, filling this need to provide order and justice. And it's interesting too, because when we actually look at how Islam expanded too, there's this kind of clash of civilizations stereotype that Islam spread by the sword. But there is also a part of the body of knowledge and the scholarship that shows that one of the reasons why Islam was able to spread is because the Byzantine Empire was crumbling and there was no order. And Muslims came in and were basically like, yeah, I mean, we're the new person in town. We're the new chief in town. So you have to understand like the historical context. I mean, we're only scratching the surface here, Reverend Kelly, but it's something that, you really have to go back into Christianity, into the Byzantine Empire, into the history of the region, and you can start putting things together,
Well, even the idea of Jesus being here to redeem our sins really comes more out of Paul
Yeah.
than actually Jesus. We used to joke in seminary that we were, okay, don't anybody send me nasty notes. But we sometimes would make a joke that it was really Paulianity, not Christianity, but because just some of the ideas that have gotten lost over the centuries.
Well, I think when the Islamic tradition came, says, if I can say that the Islamic tradition says anything, like, or Muhammad maybe himself describing his mission as being a reminder to Christians of like what worship is supposed to be like or meant to be.
Right.
And this is very interesting. And many Christians have talked about this. Michael Servetus in the 16th century, the Catholic heretic, basically said, yeah, Muhammad came to reform Christianity, to actually bring Christianity back to a pure monotheism, which is an interesting component. Perhaps Muhammad was being critical of this Pauline Christianity. But then again, Reverend Kelly, and I talk about this in my forthcoming book, the Christians of Najran in the year 630, 631, they visited Medina, Masjid al-Nabawi, and they prayed in Muhammad's mosque. And according to my understanding and my research, they were Trinitarians. And this is interesting. So Muhammad, through the Quran, made it clear that there needs to be a critical eye on the Trinity theologically. However, Muhammad did allow freedom of religion, freedom of worship to Trinitarians in the most hospitable way possible by allowing them to pray in his mosque. So interesting kind of historical tidbits.
Yeah. So we have a question that asks, do you think that both Jesus and Muhammad were avatars? That is, ones who had God consciousness in human form?
Yes, 100%. God consciousness, or Tawheed, I believe, is the proper kind of Islamic concept. Yeah, and that's, this God consciousness, or is it taqwa? Taqwa, I think, is the appropriate term. And this is one of the reasons why I kind of admire the Islamic tradition and Prophet Muhammad, is reminding us of God. And even looking at something like the Trinity here, Reverend Kelly, like when I think of the Trinity, at the top of that pyramid is still God for me.
Mhm.
It's still above Jesus or the Spirit. But yeah, now we're going down kind of Christological holes.
Well, yeah, it's a little, sometimes I think it's hard to have some of these conversations without a little Christology creeping in.
For sure.
But I thought it was a great question, because I also think that, at least for me, that, yes, I would say yes as well around Jesus and Muhammad, being avatars. And I think there's been many since then. And I think they're walking around among us now. I don't think God consciousness is as, as maybe as unique as some people may think, or only for the super really special. I think God consciousness is something we all have access to and choose to use as our driver for Tikkun Olam.
Yeah, I agree. I literally wrote that down. We all have God consciousness. We really do. I mean, that voice, that gut feeling that we have inside of us, I believe that is God. However, some of us have different intensities and levels of this God consciousness. And I also think some people run away from it and reject it,
Yeah.
which is, something in its own right, as well.
Well, it can, if we're willing to, the whole, to have an exemplary life of peace and forgiveness is a huge responsibility. Like, if I'm going to really take that on, and if we all have I believe, and I know lots of others, the God consciousness is always everywhere present, for us to use, to activate, to whatever verb. There's a responsibility in that, and to be active in peace and be active in forgiveness. And you said peace takes a long time.
It does. And the importance of action in peace and forgiveness cannot be underestimated. These things, as I mentioned in the talk, like, they don't come out of nowhere. They don't drop from the sky.
Right.
And to give other examples of, not necessarily peace, or forgiveness, but one story of Prophet Muhammad standing for the Jewish funeral procession, which is a story related in the Hadith that many Muslims know. And this shows just like a kind of fundamental respect for human dignity. But how many of us would be willing to make that difficult move where you stand up when you know it's going to be unpopular, and the people to your left and your right are going to say, "Hey, what are you doing?" Jesus and Muhammad were fearless. They led 100% all the time, and they were just like, this is what's right, and may the forces unfold, but this is what I'm standing for. And I think that's very, very powerful. I wish I had that power. I wish I could always forgive. There are some things that I have forgiven, but I'm still working on it. I'm still working on it. And peace is also difficult too. But it's very therapeutic to engage yourself with these issues and these entities. The only way to make progress is to deal with it and to activate it.
Yeah. Someone made a comment in the chat that outer peace starts with the inner peace of the person.
100%. And I think this is a really difficult conversation, especially during this time, because when we think about peace, we think about war. And when we think about war, we think about governments, right? We think about governments, oppression, human rights violations. And these things we have no control over.
Yeah.
Or do we? This is another thing. Or do we? If we live, let's say if we live in a democratic society and we have this peace within us, we're so anti-violent. We're so anti-violence that we would never put into a position of power someone who would advocate war. Imagine if we were that passionate about nonviolence and we did that, then our governments wouldn't go to war.
Yeah.
If we, so I think it's important, especially for the youth, to remind people, like, don't expect peace to happen. Don't expect your government to create peace.
Right.
Like, it starts at a smaller level.
Yeah. Your own, our inner world, my own inner demons, my own, where I'm not able to forgive, where I still hold resentment, where I have judgment. I know I said it at the beginning, I quoted the late Congressman John Lewis, but another quote of his, he's been a hero of mine for years. And he being called the conscience of Congress, to spend 60 years talking about love in the venue of politics amazes me. But what he said was that he said every human being has a spark of divinity, and it is we have a responsibility not to abuse that spark.
Amen. And that's beautiful. And that's that type of good trouble is not the right word to use here, but like John Lewis was able to effectively like just change the narrative about how we look at things. Like something like love should be taken seriously at the political level, at the highest political level of this land. And same with peace.
Right.
They're just not taken seriously. It's ridiculous. Like human beings have always fought each other. This group always fought that group. Yeah. If you think that way, then we're doomed. We are doomed. But there's hope. There's always hope.
I believe that. And there's and he even meant, like, even the first half of that statement, that every human being has a spark of divinity, and he meant everyone. And I know for me, it's sometimes I'm like really everyone, when I'm really afraid or really upset or just watching human rights being trampled or so.
Yeah. And it reminds me,
second half, not to abuse it, which also includes ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. So that inner peace again.
Yeah. And for some reason, I was just thinking about Bilal ibn Rabah. So Bilal ibn Rabah was a companion of Prophet Muhammad. He was of Ethiopian descent in ancestry, and he was also his mother was from there, but his father was Arab. And Muhammad would actively defend Bilal in front of other companions who were criticizing Bilal for his actions and then blaming his actions on his race. And Muhammad would come in and say, this verbal violence that you're giving to Bilal is part of the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance. So basically, what Muhammad is suggesting here is that to be racist is to be ignorant, and to be ignorant is to essentially be like not Muslim. Like,
wow.
So we have a powerful example here of Muhammad being active and stepping up. But the thing that I've been stressing a lot in talking about this story is that Muhammad didn't just break Bilal's chains and free him. He allowed and he created, Muhammad did, a society in which Bilal could be socially mobile and he could flourish, right? So we look at something like what happened in this country, in the United States, in Reconstruction. So people were like, oh, the slaves are free. Now all of a sudden we can wash our hands of it, and their plight is on them. But we know through various legislations and then Jim Crow that there were all these barriers put in place to prevent people from maximizing their potential. So Muhammad wasn't just looking at things like freeing people. How do you create, this is the peacemaking element, like how can you create an environment and in a culture and a society that encourages people to thrive, to be their best selves. Like, isn't that a good way to peace? Like what makes the opposite of peace? It's war, it's misery. People are unhappy, they feel unsafe.
Yeah.
And like Muhammad came and he was like, no, like we're creating a community that is whole, that is loving. And that's what Jesus did too.
So I have another question here. Is it wrong then for me to be in turmoil for the sake of others having peace? Jesus and Muhammad didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm talking about with how difficult it is to be, at least in my position, to be a Christian. Like how much skin are we willing to put in the game of following Jesus? Where Jesus is literally saying, yeah, you suffer, you essentially lose while you enter peace, or you allow someone to do something else. Like, you're basically taking on the burden. I mean, that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And people would say, and this is what I was saying earlier with Jesus being irrational. We would think of him as being completely irrational. What do you mean, love your enemies? So if someone punches me here, I'm supposed to give them my other cheek to punch them. What is he saying there? Reverend Kelly, I would love to hear your thought on that question, though. Like, because for me, growing up in Boston, Irish Italian household, we were taught to defend ourselves straight up. I mean, but the Christian element here, if someone attacks you, Jesus is saying, forgive them. I don't know, Reverend Kelly, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm genuinely interested in hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's sort of turned into I keep looking for questions and comments, and we sort of turned into a dialogue that I'm thoroughly enjoying. So my education and history and learning and my own evolution and unfolding is when that statement about turning the other cheek is, for me, is condense it into when I'm hard to love me harder. So if the person in front of me, smacks me in the face, suffice it to say they're probably pretty hard to love in that moment.
Yeah.
And yet the call is to love them even harder. Right.
Yeah.
So that's because when someone acts that way, there's always something behind it. Right. Like when we look at little kids, then, any child, if you've raised any or been around them at some point in their little personhood, they say things like, I hate you, or you're not my, you go away, I'm not your friend, or something like that. And we approach it as there's something going on. They're tired, they're hungry, something happened at school. We look behind the curtain, but as we grow older, we stop doing that.
Yeah.
And so for me, the turn the other cheek isn't necessarily it's not the literal turn and let them smack me again, but to remind me that to smack back is the reaction, as opposed to stopping and saying, okay, what this person is really communicating is, somebody please love me.
Yeah.
Like, we act that way when we're crying out. And
these people are acting out violently, but they themselves are broken.
Yes.
Right? And this is what I think,
yes.
and this is what Muhammad was saying too, with the jihad, with the inner struggle. Like the greater jihad is the struggle against, having patience versus impatience, the ability to listen versus excluding people and neglecting them and saying, I don't care. Right. So it's really about like placing yourself in other people's shoes and saying, like, how can I understand them so that they can get beyond this hate of me? Like, why do they hate me? So helping people fix themselves first, I suppose.
And what would have to be going on for me to act the way that they are? Like, what would have to be going on inside me? How much pain and suffering or anger or unforgiveness or resentment, whatever, but what would have to be going on in my life for me to respond that way? it requires me to stop, to pause, to, look behind the curtain, and to remember. And it's a practice, please. It's not like
It's
always.
hard.
Yeah. But the more you practice it, it's like building muscles. Your body remembers, your heart remembers.
Yeah. And this is why John Lewis was such a loss, because he was operating on a different wavelength, a different level of politics, and bringing these things into the mainstream.
Yeah.
And they need to go mainstream. These things, like, talking about peace building, peacemaking,
Yeah.
peacemaking for sure.
Well, we've come to our hour already. And I don't see any. So there is a comment in the chat that says, I believe remorse comes before sincere forgiveness. I think that's
yes.
Yeah, you would have to have some remorse, some guilt.
Yeah.
Not,
I mean,
like guilt, but
yeah, forgiveness is a process too. Like, I know, as I mentioned earlier, I've had moments where it took me so long to forgive someone for doing something to me. It was almost like the stages of grief, like you have to get through stuff. And then when it happens, it's just like, oh, now I get why Jesus and Muhammad were saying, forgive.
Well, and sincerely, from really a place of authenticity. And
of course. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. And it's just, hate and anger and violence, they can't be bottled up. They have to be let out. We have to engage in therapeutic ways of talking about some of the stuff that drives the worst in us as humans.
Hi, Ayub.
Hello.
Welcome
Oh my
back.
gosh. It's almost over. I
Yeah.
can't believe it. Thank you so much, Dr. Craig Considine, for a very, not just wonderful, but also very meaningful talk on a Wednesday evening. I know that you're a true supporter of dialogue and peace, and not just lip service, but also action man. So thank you again. The last time I remember I forgave someone. I don't get mad or I don't get in trouble with many people, but it was my own uncle, because of in a way, the unrest in Turkey, the political oppression against, I would say, people of goodwill and innocent people. And I, in a way, stopped talking to him for a few years, which not many people know that. And because he was not kind of feeling empathy or supporting those innocent people. He was, but after 4 years, I attended a talk by a motivational speaker at university, and I decided to forgive him. I felt so relieved. I really felt so relieved. I sometimes make fun of myself. I am overweight, but when I forgave him, I felt like, oh, I'm super skinny. But actually, it's I don't like to say using the word of the coincidence, but if in a few days, this Saturday, it's an Islamic holiday called Berat Kandili in Turkish, which is the night of forgiveness. We didn't intend to schedule this event just a few days before that night, but it is actually this coming Saturday. So this event could be hopefully an inspiration for many people to forgive their loved ones, and not loved ones, but any human being, because people are really thirsty for love and acceptance in our world. People with hatred does not really live a very peaceful life, because I don't think we can live a happy life by hating others. So we do not like to say bye-bye or even goodbye. We want to say see you again. The month of Ramadan is coming up. The month of love, the month of forgiveness, the month of generosity and mercy is coming up. And as Dialogue Institute of Kansas City, we have scheduled how many events, Kelly?
Oh, what is it? 15, 16?
Yeah, 14 events or virtual events with 15 different groups.
Wow.
A lot of different faith communities, Habitat for Humanity, Interfaith Center, Miami University. And what is more unique this year, we are gonna virtually visit families in South Africa, Netherlands, Belgium, United Kingdom. Even we will have a speaker from Australia. And we will have the videos of small kids from Tanzania, South Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, United States, and a few other families who live in, even actually one of my favorite example, I guess, will be Costa Rica. A Muslim family will be dining with a Christian family from Costa Rica, and we are gonna visit their home virtually. So we are gonna actually the events, all of them have been scheduled, and we are gonna soon share on social media and our website. And the first one will be on April 14th with Grace and Holy Trinity Cathedral. During Ramadan, in addition to having these virtual events because of the pandemic, we have one other exciting project, which we call Giving Ramadan, inspired by Giving Tuesday concept. So Giving Ramadan, we have 4 projects. One is toy drive for foster care children, virtual food drive for people in need, and also we are gonna serve food for homeless people, partnering with Micah Ministry, and also partnering with the domestic violence shelter for women, Relentless Pursuit in Kansas City. And all of these events will be live streamed on our YouTube channel, Dialogue Institute of Kansas City. Yeah, I guess that's it for today. Thank you so much.